This is part 3 of the recording for week 5, part slideshow 1. We're starting now at slide 15. So, the Russians had already invested in the Chinese Communist Party, and they instructed the Chinese Communist Party to join up and have a united front with the Chinese nationalists. And indeed, they invested a lot of money in the Chinese nationalists. They shipped arms to them by ocean to the port of Canton after the Chinese nationalists had secured it with the help of a local warlord. They sent advisors. 2 of them are pictured here and are considered to be very positive historical figures in China today. They assisted with organization, both party organization. The Chinese Nationalist Party and the Chinese Communist Party have a lot in common in their structure and in their disciplinary style. They are both Leninist parties, something I shouldn't go into here, but you can look up the word Leninist. Probably a good Wikipedia page on that, probably a good set of readings elsewhere on that. And they provided an awful lot of money, hoping that the KMT would eventually work their way north, overcome the warlords, unite the country, and keep the Japanese tied down in China. Because if there was one thing the Russians did not want, it was for the Japanese to become stronger and to turn their attention to the north. And indeed, there were Japanese who wanted to do that. Let's go on to slide 16. And so, with the assistance of Russian advisors and with the participation of the Chinese communists, including the senior Chinese communist, then still a very young man, Zhou Enlai, who was the political commissar of the Chinese Military Academy, they made their way north. And because the warlord forces were generally not as well equipped, not as well organized, and not as motivated, thanks not the least to the political education system, the political commissar system, similar to the Russian army that had been set up amongst the nationalists, the KMT forces were able to steadily move north. The other half of this, though, was that they made their progress partly by striking up alliances with warlords that would rather not put up a fight. This came back to haunt them later on because the nature of the Kuomintang KMT coalition that governed China a decade later had really not changed much. It was still based on agreements with local power brokers who did not owe anything other than a personal loyalty at best to Chiang Kai-shek. So there are some examples of people here, they're mentioned in the readings, who were major warlords and who remained powers in the decades that followed. Let's go on to slide 17. I'm very disappointed that I could not get you this movie, The Sand Pebbles, streamed through D2L, because it gives, in spite of the fact that it's partly a double love story and the story of a crew aboard a U.S. warship, it gives a very good taste of what was going on in China in the time of the Northern Expedition, leading up to the Nationalist-Communist split in April of 1927. And one of the scenes, for example, where the coolie who'd been trained by the Steve McQueen character has been captured and is being tortured, he's been captured and tortured by people who are referred to as Bolsheviks, who were Chinese communists, who were, during this time, on their own. There were some units that were that were dominated by Chinese Communist cadre and were not loyal to the nationalists very much at all. They were in a coalition with them. And one such set of infantry units entered Nanking, or Nanjing, in March of 1927, and they decided to start killing foreigners. Of course, this got everybody all upset. Amongst the foreign powers, it became world news, and it quickly became apparent to Chiang Kai-shek, who did not want this to happen, because he was starting to realize that he was going to need Western assistance if he would eventually be able to overcome the Japanese. He realized that he was going to have to get rid of the communists. There were several incidents that led up to this that contributed to his decision, and he made it a surprise attack on 12 April 1927. He moved against the communists first in Shanghai and then throughout the country with the assistance of his allies in organized crime. And in the months that followed, there were various fights throughout the country. The communists ended up putting together their own armed forces, their own units, and retreating into the hills that eventually became their base in Ruijin and in other parts of Jiangxi province, which is in south-central China in the mountains away from the coast. During the same month that this happened, in Shanghai, the forces of the the warlord in the north, the Manchurian warlord Zhang Zuolin, decided to invade the Russian embassy, the Soviet embassy in Peking. Again, this is where all the foreign embassies were in Peking. All this time, ever since 1913, when Yuan Shikai was in charge. And they did this in a coordinated fashion. It's very interesting, along with the foreign powers. The military attachés, the French, British, and American military attachés worked together with the Zhang Zuolin forces to prepare for this embassy invasion. And they had Russian language specialists on hand who assisted in translating the documents that were recovered. If you've seen that movie Argo that I mentioned a couple weeks ago, where it looked like there was pretty precise planning surrounding the invasion and occupation of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran in 1979, indeed, it was basically the same sort of thing. So Li Dajia, one of the two founders of the Chinese Communist Party, was there at the time, and he was summarily executed without so much as a thank you very much. And things moved on. Let's go on to slide 18. A book that I recommend you read if you're interested in further study about China is that everybody reads when they start to look at that country closely is Edgar Snow's Red Star Over China. In Red Star Over China, he talks about how when he's trying to figure out how he's going to get to the communist hideout in Yan'an, how he talks to peasants, and they refer to the communist forces as Zhu Mao, Zhu being for Juda and Mao for Mao Zedong. They were thought of as one person because, of course, this was the days before the internet and thorough research that was available to all members of the public. And there was a little bit of misinformation about the nature of the communist forces. However, they were there, and they were receiving most of the money that the Soviet Union was sending to China through Shanghai. They used different people, including the American communist Steve Nelson, who at one point, he was in a Comintern school learning how to be a spy, basically, in Moscow in 1933, when he was told that he should get ready for a secret mission. They were pulling him out of his school, and they ended up giving him a money belt with 100,000 US dollars in it, and putting him on a cruise liner that went to China through the Suez Canal from France, where he got off the boat, nervous as hell, and delivered his $100,000 to a representative of the Comintern who was living clandestinely as somebody else. We'll get into a little bit more of that in a moment. And that money all went basically to, this was in 1934, that money went basically to Jumao, to the Jiangxi forces that you see pictured here. It was an interesting situation because from 1928 to 31, the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee was in Shanghai, and they were technically in charge, but they were living underground, underground sort of life, and in spite of the fact that they were in charge, they really had no power. All the real power was in the hands of Jumao, Juda, and Mao Zedong in Jiangxi, because they had the army, and they didn't have to necessarily listen to everything that came out of Shanghai and the Central Committee. And eventually, as the years went on and the noose grew tighter around urban communists, the urban communist leadership had to slowly evacuate. And we'll come to a table after a few more slides that shows just how much damage was done. Anyway, let's go on to slide 19 and talk a little bit about what the Russians were up to. The Communist International, or the Comintern, had agents all over Asia at this time, and this is why the foreign powers were not very happy about communist influence, because these Comintern agents were doing the same thing in other Asian countries that they were doing in China. They were building up networks, organizing workers to go on strike, founding armed movements, all of which were intended to cause instability and eventual overthrow of local governments in favor of communist regimes. It was all very well done. It was all very efficient. It was all, the tradecraft, as people like to say, was extraordinary. And these were very brave people. They were highly qualified people. They had the sort of guts that that people with a lot of guts have today. They were hard-bitten individuals, as were the Chinese communists, with a lot of experience and who could actually undergo torture and not sing like a bird, unlike some of their contemporaries like Mr. Xiang Zhongfa. Anyway, the picture here is of the couple who were referred to as the New Lens couple. Supposedly they were from Belgium. However, they were actually both Soviet intelligence officers, one from the Ukraine and the other from Russia, who were a married couple who met when he was an NKVD, the predecessor of the KGB. He was an NKVD agent, and she was a Soviet Foreign Service officer. The campaign to win their release was led by Sun Yat-sen's widow, Song Qingling, who had been Sun Yat-sen's decoder, taking care of coding and decoding his telegraph messages that he sent to his supporters. She later used those skills as a communist agent herself. She was in an extraordinarily privileged position as Sun Yat-sen's widow, and lived in areas that were held by the nationalists, who dared not arrest her for the public furor that it would cause, but she worked along with underground communists to further that cause. Let's go on to slide 20 and then she stayed in the People's Republic after 1949 as a national hero. Soviet GRU, the Soviet military intelligence, played a very prominent role in China during this time. Very prominent, but very secret. They had the best urban networks of any intelligence organization that was in China, be they foreign or Chinese. The information that was recovered, for example, from the embassy raid in late April of 1927 showed that they had networks in over 100 cities. These networks quickly dispersed when all this happened because they had excellent communications and they really didn't lose too many people. And they continued to run excellent networks all over China. The object of these networks was, again, to assess what was going on with Japan, the Imperial Japanese Army, and the Navy, whether or not the Japanese intended to turn their attentions toward Russia and take some of the Soviet Far East away from Russia. You can see in that bottom photograph there a graduation picture from one of the classes at Sun Yat-sen University in Moscow. I think this is 1930. And these are people who have all been trained to do different things in their home countries. They're not all Chinese. Some of them are probably from other countries. I'd say the man on the far left there, for example, may be Indonesian or Malay. They all went back to their own countries and did organizing on behalf of the international communist movement. Let's go on to slide 21. This is a very interesting figure here. I won't spend much time on her, but she wrote a biography called Sonia's Report. That's Sonia's Report. Ruth Werner was sent to Moscow for training after being recruited by Sergei, the man on the previous slide. And as a single mother with 2 little kids, lived under local conditions in Manchuria, running a secret radio network and an agent network where she communicated between Moscow and the GRU communist agents who were ethnic Chinese on the ground. Absolutely amazing, the sort of things that these people used to do. Later on, a decade later, she moved to Britain and was the recruiter and handler of the British atomic spy Klaus Fuchs, who gave the Soviets atomic secrets. Let's go on to slide 22. I don't want to make a big deal out of this, but you can see the numbers speak for themselves here. You can see when lots of communists were arrested by the KMT, and you can see how much trouble they were in. Not only in the cities, but in the countryside, and their spies within the KMT army, how much trouble they were in 1931, 32, and 33. They were almost defeated by the nationalists during this period. They came very close to extinction, something that is not often noted in histories about this time. Let's go on to slide 23. So for Japan, not only Manchuria, but really the Soviet Far East, was very attractive. It was a place where people could be resettled from the Japanese home islands and from Korea in order to increase agricultural production, industrial production, and other things like coal mining. There was some petroleum in Manchuria, but not enough, and this is one reason, of course, why the Japanese ended up turning south instead of north as World War II approached. I'd better stop here and make it a 4th and final file after this.